Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishnan. Now I'd like to introduce Kevin Page. I've learned in the last week a lot from him. He's a very humble person, but don't let it fool you. He has great knowledge, great experience, and incredibly useful. We're lucky to have you. Please, Dr. Page. You didn't like to be called Doctor. Mr. Page.
Scared of the mic. Minister, colleagues, friends, thank you very much, CAPRI. Thank you so much for this invitation, for making this happen. Sometimes people ask, like, what does a fiscal counselor look like? You know, obviously somebody very good looking, somebody with a lot of charisma, somebody with real sex appeal. Sometimes no hair, glasses, all the rest. In 2008, I was asked to build an independent fiscal institution for Canada. And I found it was a kind of an intimidating experience. It was the first one for Canada, a little bit different fiscal situation than Jamaica. We had our fiscal crisis in the 1990s. We had improved our public finances significantly. But we launched, and I took the job in the spring of 2008. You know, by the fall of 2008, we found ourselves in a financial crisis, a global financial crisis. We went from 11 years of surpluses, reducing our debt in nominal terms, dramatically reducing the debt, like Jamaica, as a percent of income, as a percent of GDP. But then things just changed. And then so we found, again, that question that's come up, why do we have a fiscal council? What could we do? So I was asked to talk about what are they, what are they not? Do they matter? Do they matter a lot? Do they matter a little? So what are they? So they're nonpartisan, not bipartisan, they're nonpartisan public bodies. They're a public body. They're not the Bank of Jamaica, but nonetheless they're a public body. They're financed typically by taxpayers. What do? They promote sustainable public finances, as Uma and the Minister has talked about. And they do this through different ways. They do this through monitoring compliance to these fiscal rules. Most countries now have these fiscal rules, these targets, like in Jamaica, to balance the books, to hit certain percentages on something called the primary balance, to hit certain targets of debt to GDP over the medium term. So they monitor that compliance, probably the most important function. They produce or they endorse planning frameworks, like those economic assumptions. Where is the economy going? Where is the Jamaican economy going? What is a reasonable planning assumption? They may produce their own sets of numbers, or they could just endorse the government's numbers, like the Auditor General potentially will do, has that function in Jamaica today. And they could provide advice on fiscal matters. It come up in discussions over the past few days. Well, what about these fiscal rules? Does Jamaica have good fiscal rules? Will a fiscal council opine on potentially other approaches or scenarios to get to these fiscal rules? And they're independent organizations. So even though they may have a reporting relationship to the executive in some cases, they could have a reporting relationship to the legislature. Some are even embedded in the audit function. But they're independent. So by independent, I mean, like whoever these fiscal councils are, you hold them responsible for their work and their advice. You want to know that they have not been influenced directly or indirectly from a political party or from potentially even the public service. So you hold them responsible and accountable for their work. So what are the principal objectives? And I think we heard it from the Minister and Uma. There's really three. The Minister talked about it's fiscal credibility, first and foremost. That's what you consider the development or the implementation of a fiscal council. Number two, accountability. You want fiscal accountability. And both of those objectives, the credibility and the accountability, that's linked to hitting those targets. It's compliance. Once the government decides, Parliament gets behind these targets, you want to achieve those targets, and that's critical for success. The third, I think, a principal objective is just transparency. You need to, get underneath those rocks, whatever you have. You need to get people to understand, not just financial people, but all parliamentarians, the media, the citizens, what's behind these numbers? What's behind these economic projections, these fiscal projections, like what is the level of pain that is out there when you're running these large primary surpluses? So you want fiscal transparency. There could be no accountability with transparency. And I think as we've learned around the world, there's this big imbalance of information that is often held by the executive and the public service, not often shared. So again, the idea of these fiscal councils is to make things a lot more open. Why do they exist? They exist because I think we've all learned in all countries, including Canada, that if you have unconstrained fiscal policy, like you run into troubles. You run into those high debt, relationships. You lose credit rating. You end up paying more interest costs. You lose that fiscal room to maneuver. It gets difficult to provide the services that are absolutely essential for citizens. I think there's no political environment in the world that is not, doesn't have to deal with deficit bias. I think it's kind of ingrained in all, no offense ministers, but all ministers around the world, it's not a Jamaican issue, it's every issue. Like every country in the world struggles to balance their books. So I think that is just a fact. There's this deficit bias that is talked about. I think we've also learned that fiscal rules, just by themselves, it's not enough. It's not enough for government to have a target to say we'll have a balanced budget next year, or we're going to hit a 60% debt to GDP target in 25-26. You need somebody else opining on that to provide a little bit of backbone. But I think the lessons learned is that these independent fiscal institutions, they can help. So what do fiscal councils look like? Well, I kind of already said that. They look like me. But often they're appointed counselors. You could have 1, 2, or 3 appointed counselors, and they tend to be small. You could also have, usually often a technical group, usually a handful of people, it could be 10 people. And so they tend to be small groups. Again, when you look at, and the minister asked me to talk a little bit, when you look at, there's 40 of these fiscal councils in the world. So when Jamaica moves forward with their fiscal council, they are not alone. When I was asked to be the parliamentary budget officer in Canada, the first thing I did is I went to the United States and I said, help me. Because they had this fiscal institution at the time. There are about a half a dozen of these, or maybe upwards of roughly 10 fiscal councils in the world. Again, there's 40 now. So it's not like if Jamaica is considering this, there's a lot to be learned by different experiences, but as the minister said, the one that you choose has to be Jamaican. But there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's very small ones, there's larger ones. They differ in the makeup of the counselors, the difference in visibility. Some, you can go to some cities, like London, England, and you'll hear, or Washington, and you'll hear lots of information coming out of these fiscal councils. They'll be in the newspapers, the Washington Post, or the Financial Times in London. And the genesis is different. A lot of them, since the financial crisis, have been created almost for the same type of reasons you're thinking about it in Jamaica. But again, in Canada, we launched ours in 2008. We were running surpluses, and our debt to GDP had cut in half in the 1990s. So there's differences often in the genesis. In the budgets, they can be a few million a year to 10 million plus a year in terms of US dollars. So there's quite a range, right? So finding that right range is an important thing for Jamaica. So what makes a successful or unsuccessful fiscal council? 3 things. 1, you want good design. And number 2, you need effective fiscal rules, the right fiscal rules for the right time for Jamaica. And number 3, it's leadership. Because we have 40 fiscal councils, you can now look back at what are the principles to establish a good one. Like, how do you know that this is a good design for Jamaica? So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of case studies now that you can go back in this decision-making process, and you can look at what does it mean to be homegrown, or to be indigenous, as the minister said. Like, how do you, you're talking about this transition from the IMF or EPOC. So what is that? That's a Jamaican factor that you have to build into it. You have many credible institutions in this country. I spent time with them this week, like the Planning Institute. Like, what is it, again, that independence and nonpartisanship? How do you enshrine independence and nonpartisanship in Jamaica? Everybody says Jamaica, well, politics is different in Jamaica. They talk about it's like there's really divided. But you know what? I watch TV every night. I watch CNN. Those Republicans and those Democrats, I'm not seeing them coming together. Politics is divided everywhere. What is the mandate? What is the scope of the mandate for this institution? How big, how broad do you want it to be? Is it just around these fiscal rules? Or there's other things that you want them to do? Again, that's something that needs to be homegrown. Issues around the relationship to the legislature. There has to be a relationship to the legislature. Even if this reports to the executive, Ultimately, it's the legislature's job to hold, to hold the government to account, the executive to account. I'll speak to that. And these effective fiscal rules, the number two thing, like if, you can't have a successful independent fiscal institution, fiscal council with bad fiscal rules. People talk to me in some of the meetings this week, well, we don't want to create a pulpit for an unelected official to kind of opining on the future of Jamaica. So if the mandate of an independent fiscal institution is to really look at the fiscal rule, and you define that mandate very carefully, and you make sure that this council or councilors, they stick within that mandate. And so leadership, people say, what's the secret sauce? It's leadership, right? You need to get somebody that looks charismatic, that's good looking, that has sex appeal. What are they not? The minister said, he asked me that question, I said, what are they not? These independent fiscal institutions, they are not policymakers. They have no right to decide a policy direction or priority for the country. There shouldn't be opining on labor market policy or policy for kids or educational policy. That is not their job. They're bean counters effectively. That's what I am. They're opining on those fiscal rules. That's their mandate. They are not auditors. So they are not looking backwards. They are looking forwards. A lot of the work that comes from the IMF. They are projecting forward. They're putting cost estimates. They're building assumptions. They're playing with sensitivities. They're providing all this transparency. And number three, they are not elected officials. They cannot make fiscal decisions. They can't tell a government what to do. They don't provide authorities to the government. Only elected MPs do that. And, they cannot instill political courage for those governments to make those tough decisions and those tough trade-offs. But they can explain the trade-offs in numerical terms. So bottom line, so I close on this, because I know Mr. King, actually, this mic scares me, Mr. King scares me. I find him to be very intimidating. Because he said 10 minutes, so there's no panacea. If you have a good fiscal council, it's not going to solve all your problems, right? There's other issues, and the minister talked about that, but they can help. They can help with those issues of fiscal credibility, for fiscal accountability and transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Page, Kevin. Yes, Dr. King is scary. He's also disruptive, but it's always constructive. So everybody, hold on to your seats. Here he is.
Minister, fellow panelists, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. We wanted to understand why this was necessary. And the minister kicked off with a compelling explanation in answer to that question. And we needed to know what this thing could look like. And we got a very clear explanation of that from Kevin. It should look like Kevin. I wanted to talk about the how. Kevin pointed out that, it's not sufficient to have fiscal rules. Well, it's also not sufficient to have a fiscal council. It's not enough. We are accustomed in Jamaica, and every country will tell you the same thing, that they have institutions that don't work. Laws are passed, institutions are established, executive directors are appointed, and the institution does not deliver on its mandate. We have an Office of the Contractor General that does excellent work, that tries its best to execute its mandate, but in the 30 years since it has been set up, how many prosecutions have actually been successfully completed in terms of failures of procurement? The National Environment and Planning Agency, from time to time, fails to protect the coastal environment. It is also true that governments break the law. Governments break the law everywhere. So it's not sufficient just to pass legislation. The contractor general himself told us in 2012 that the contract to construct the North-South Highway literally broke the law. And many of us remember, amidst the euphoria of Jamaica qualifying for the 1998 World Cup, 20 years ago, that the Prime Minister himself broke the law by announcing summarily a public holiday the day after qualification. He was not prosecuted for breaking the law. That is not how you get public holidays in Jamaica or pretty much anywhere else. It's not something that the law allowed him to do by fiat. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, it was pretty common for the government to conspire with the central bank to break the law limiting the amount by which the government could borrow from the central bank. So the question then is, it's one thing for us all to come here and agree that a fiscal council is needed and that it ought to be established, and it's a good thing, but how do we get from that to an effective public institution that is going to do its job? What are the hurdles that need to be crossed? What are the challenges in doing so? Well, I don't know the answer. But we can collectively speculate on what that might be. The first element of it, I think, is that it has to have the necessary competencies. It's actually difficult for public agencies in Jamaica to have the technical competencies, because technical skills are highly prized in the labor market. And the civil service salary structure really doesn't allow you to accommodate particular technical skills being paid more than the minister. So how do you retain that talent? The Planning Institute has wonderful people working for it, but they very often lose their most technically competent people to Sagicor. My notes actually say JMMB, but I picked Sagicor for a particular reason. The second issue is, does it have an adequate budget? And this doesn't even have to go to a future administration deliberately wanting to starve the institution of an adequate budget so it can silence a voice of responsibility. As you appreciate, there are many legitimate demands for public resources. And in that space, is it going to be adequately resourced to do what it has to do? NEPA is responsible for ensuring that the turtle population has an appropriate environment and can survive, but it doesn't have a budget for them to visit the beaches where the turtles are. The other issue, which Kevin has touched on already, is it going to have sufficient political independence? Notwithstanding the National Works Agency adhering to the procurement law and the Office of the Contractor General diligently trying to pursue and point out violations from the procurement laws, it happens that very often contracts end up being delivered by connected parties. So these are not all of the challenges, these are not all of the hurdles, but it seems clear that at least these need to be addressed if we're going to end up with an effective public institution to do this job. It's not impossible. Jamaica does have effective public institutions that carry out their mandate responsibly, effectively, and adequately. So there is hope. But solving that problem that takes us from passing the legislation, establishing the institution, all the way to having an effective fiscal council is of fundamental importance. Potentially, it can be transformative. We know that outcomes come from policies. We have seen that we change policies and we get better outcomes. Many instances of that over the last 5 years. Why doesn't everybody just adopt good policies? Because policies come out of good quality public institutions. And so it is creating the quality institutions that really is a challenge. Countries that have high inflation are because their central banks end up printing lots of money. Why do some central banks end up printing lots of money? Because we know it causes high inflation and devalues the currency and ruins the economy. Because they have weak central banks. So it's one thing to understand what needs to be created and why it needs to be created. But how we go about this is what really needs to exercise our minds over the next few months and years as we try to establish this institution. And Jamaica's own economic history indicates how important this is. Over most of the last 30 to 40 years, Jamaica has suffered from either high rates of inflation or high rates of public indebtedness. That is because we had a weak central bank. And the weak central bank was subsumed to fiscal policy. We ran fiscal deficits for 4 out of every 5 years since independence. And large fiscal deficits for all of the dozen years in which we were already one of the most indebted countries in the world. In the presence of a weak central bank, there is no way to correct for that and maintain a stable currency. With a strong central bank, which apparently we now have, low inflation, a stable exchange rate. So it is critically important that we get this right. If we get this right, it has the potential to ensure, or at least make highly likely, that the next 30 or 40 years will have neither the high inflation nor the high debt that we have experienced for the last 40. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King. As we noticed, CAPRI cares about the clock. We started very close to on time, and each speaker did, in fact, stick to the time allotted. Amazing. That means we've got about 50 minutes for questions and answers. And just to focus on the importance of this event, a wise person suggested that to be enlightened, you should know the answer to this question, which is, what event of great importance have you been involved in that had nothing to do with you as an individual? It might seem like an easy question, but if you think about it, it's not an easy one to answer. It takes some detachment from self. But this is one of those events for me. It's a very important initiative. First one in the region, incredibly important for Jamaica's future and for future generations. So I count myself as very, very lucky to be involved in it and to be part of something that is incredibly important that has nothing to do with me. Anyway, I will not say any more. I'll move straight into the questions and answers, and perhaps I will bowl the first ball. I see Governor Winter has joined us. He came because he heard that Dr. King was going to big up BOJ. And I'll ask Minister Clark if you would permit me. There have been various comments in the press, and tonight it's the it's on perhaps everybody's tongue, which is epoch and what epoch was. We heard tonight it was perhaps, as Uma said, maybe she's never heard of, never seen anything quite like it. So it was definitely indigenous, Jamaican, and it worked. But now, as in everything, as you evolve, it means change, and now we're evolving into something else. But I think it's very important for everybody to understand the link between the two. In other words, this evolution, if you could give us your views, please, as to how you see it, please. Thank you, Minister.